Hello. Thanks for being here, everybody. My name is Russ. And I'm excited to see you. There's like a lot of you right now. Yeah. Go June. Yes. All right. So, what is that? Jesus. All right. Yeah. Okay. That's cool too. So, I come from a family of storytellers. So like growing up, grew up in Trumbull, my grandpa lived down the street, and I spent as much time with him as possible because he was a really good storyteller. And he would tell the same stories over and over again because he had like 7 of them. And my family would be sitting around the table at like a party or whatever, and they'd be like, oh, there he goes again, because he was really long-winded about everything. And I was like, yes, tell us again, because he'd always change like one little detail. And they were all true stories, but like you couldn't tell which one was the most true. Because they're all a little bit different. But I loved it. And now my dad is also an incredible storyteller. He just likes to make them up on the spot, though. They're in no way or shape or form true. And they're always like magical in some way. He's like C.S. Lewis or whatever. And my kids love it. One of my kids was featured up here earlier by accident. That was a nice surprise. But she loves the stories too. And for me, like, it's cool for a little bit, but I'm like, yeah, okay, I'm gonna leave now because the stories never ends with my dad. He just loves telling stories and crafting worlds and all that stuff. But when we get together for family parties, my brother lives in Virginia, he comes up, the rest of my family's in Connecticut, we all get together, and when we're all together, one of the things that we love to do is just share family stories. And I don't know about you guys, but we don't have a written history of our family. Does anybody have a written history of their family? I think you have to be royalty for that to happen, or super weird. But we have an oral history to my family. All these family stories told by my grandpa, told by my parents, and that is our family history. So we love like reliving old moments where like someone did something a little silly, we all laugh at them at their expense, and it's so fun. We tell it every time we get together, we tell these specific family stories. And maybe you don't have a family that gets together and tells family stories, but maybe you have a group of friends that's much like a family, and you guys get together and you tell these funny stories about your friend doing something stupid. And that one friend's like, everyone's like, laughing at your friend. It's the best. It's the greatest. I love those stories. And one of the stories that my family tells when we gather everybody around, I actually am not sure if I told this story before, so I asked Heather, she said I haven't, so if you've heard it before, you get to hear it again. Because we tell it all the time. It's a staple. And this story is the story of my mom when she first got a full-time job again. I was somewhere around like 5th grade. And my parents wanted to finally take us on a vacation. We hadn't really been on a real vacation ever, and they were gonna take us on a vacation because we could afford it. We were like, yes, what's it gonna be? They're like, we're gonna go to Arizona and see the Grand Canyon. In my 5th grade mind, I was like, yes, that sounds great. I had 2 older siblings. So we went to Arizona and I saw the Grand Canyon for like 2 minutes and then I was done. 5th graders were around there. It's like, we're just looking at that. It's just a hole in the ground and we're gonna look at it from a bunch of different angles. And I was like, this looks the same everywhere we go. And I wanna say I have been back as an adult, much different experience. You cry a lot more. But as a 5th grader, I was like, this is the worst. And the plan was that we were gonna go ride donkeys down into the Grand Canyon. If you've never been to the Grand Canyon before, the elevation difference between the edge where you stand and look over railings in some spots and the bottom is like 5,000 to 6,000 feet, okay? So it's a big hole in the ground, right? Biggest hole ever. Congratulations, Grand Canyon, you did it. So that's mind-blowing thinking about that. It's really far down. And so one of the ways that you can go down, there's all sorts of signs when you start hiking down that say, don't go past this point, you'll never come back. Like you're dead, that's the type of signs. So we're gonna ride these donkeys down this really narrow path. It's like 4 feet wide or something like that, and it goes down the side of one of the cliffs. In the advertisement for this donkey place, it says, we've never lost a donkey. And you're like, that is not helpful, not reassuring, because I wasn't worried about the donkeys. I was worried about me, all right? My brother could go over. My sister could go over. I would like my parents to survive. But the donkeys, and they're like, they're specially trained donkeys. I'm like, but I'm not a specially trained me. So We did a test run that is too long of a story to tell for tonight. It didn't go well before we went out to Arizona, so we scratched the donkeys. And instead, because my mom had the sweet job, we were gonna take a helicopter over the Grand Canyon. Yes, it was cool. Have you done it? Okay, because you sounded really encouraging, like we were on the same wavelength. There we go. We like helicopters. And so we go on this helicopter ride anyways. It's cool, you get to see the Grand Canyon from another perspective, rather than looking at it straight on, whatever. And so we land. And as we're coming down for a landing, the pilot lets us know, just so you know, when you get off the helicopter, because the helicopter was off when we got in, so we got to walk tall and stuff and take a seat in it. You're gonna wanna hunch over and run, because I gotta go. Like, I had to go land at a different helicopter pad after I drop you off, so I'm not staying. So in my mind, this is gonna be like an action sequence, and I'm the shortest out of everybody because I'm the youngest, so as soon as we landed, I was like crouched like this, trying to dodge the blades as you run, because they tell you to crouch so you don't get your head chopped off, but like there's no way I was gonna do that because I was too short. So we all run off the helipad. There's like a little runway to get to, it's like a walkway to get to the building that like the helicopter runs out of. And I turn around, and I'm like, we did it. Turn around, I count us 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm like, we're missing somebody. This is an important note to make at this point. My brother was in high school, and he had been going through this goth phase. If you don't know what a goth is, I'm not gonna do a good job honoring them as I describe them, so I'm not going to. And so my brother had curly red hair, but he straightened it to look more sad. And he wore like a jean jacket that he cut the sleeves off of and frayed the shoulders. And then he wore like black band t-shirts underneath them, and then it said like Harley Davidson on the back of the jean vest. And he wore a necklace that had spikes coming out of it. And he wore Jinko jeans. They're actually making a comeback, and I have no idea why. But Jinko jeans are like jeans that they go over like your whole entire foot. They're so baggy. He also had these pants that had lots of straps. I'm not really sure what the straps did, but I think you can make it into a backpack, and it's not a joke. You can make it into some sort of like satchel for different goth things. And so one of the main features in all of my brother's outfits was this wallet that had a chain that connected to his belt and then would loop down past his knee, and the wallet sat in his pocket. And there's definitely nothing in the wallet. It was just the fashion statement of having a sweet chain. So as I looked back on the helipad, I saw my brother hanging from the helicopter by his chain. Yeah, and he was frantically trying to escape, but it wasn't happening. He was just stuck, hanging there by his chain. That's a story that we love to relive. It makes my brother just like, he's like, ugh. We had to say this story again, and he has to endure it over and over again, and we love it because it's hilarious. And it reminds us of who we are as a family. What we've been through as a family. We have all sorts of stories like this. And how it didn't matter what weird phase me or any of my siblings had been in at any point, my parents were incredibly supportive. My mom went out by herself to Hot Topic to buy those Jinko jeans. All sorts of different pairs. Came home to make sure they fit right and then returned the ones that didn't. My parents are very supportive. And we're together as a family. Those stories remind us of that. So we have these family stories that bring us together. We're continuing in our series about abiding in Christ and the life we get to live. And today I get to talk about sharing our faith stories. So a couple questions I wanted to tackle today are, what is a faith story? Who shares a faith story? And why would they be shared? So I want to take a look at a passage. It's in Romans 10. It's going to give us a biblical perspective of why we would share our faith stories. So Romans 10, it's a short one, 13 through 15. Romans 10, 13 through 15. Here we go. It's going to be on the screen too as I read. It says, "For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. How then can they call on the one they have not believed in? And how can they believe in the one of whom they have not heard? And how can they hear without someone preaching to them? And how can anyone preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. We all know someone whom we desperately want to know Jesus. We want them to know the freedom and the love and the life of what it feels like to live your life with Christ. So how can they believe in Jesus? Well, from the passage, it says what? Someone has to preach to them, right? That was in the passage? Yes. So who preaches? Surely not me. I hope you guys are thinking that right now. They're like, oh no. Is it me? Yes, it's you. Any believer who has been saved by grace by Jesus, you have something to tell them. And it might be intimidating. You can preach. And it might be intimidating because at this point you're like, oh no, what do I say, right? I've been in those situations a bunch of times where I'm standing there completely blank. I'm like, I don't know what to do. This is like the perfect opportunity. What do I do? What am I supposed to say? This is where stories come in. Our faith stories introduce people to Jesus. A situation could play out like this. I've seen it play out in my life, and I've heard from many friends and stories that this happens to them as well. You're at work or school or some sort of event where you see the same people often. At this point in my life, it's like kids' soccer practice, kids' baseball games that just go on for eternity. There's all sorts of different situations where people get together often. And someone may come up to you and say, you're different than everybody else. And I can't figure out why. Somebody ever said that to you? Yeah? I got a bunch of nods for that. I don't know what encourages people just to tell people that, but it happens a lot. There's something different about you. Or something really big is happening in the world and they say, how are you handling this crisis? You seem like everything's okay. How are you handling this personal crisis you're going through? When your life is falling apart, when you've been radically changed by an encounter with Jesus, people in your life notice. They notice you're different than everybody else, and they ask you about it. I don't know what brings them to ask you about it. Maybe it's the Holy Spirit working in them. But this is your chance to tell them why. This is your chance to share why. And you feel ill-equipped because you're like, oh man, I'm supposed to know scriptures at this point. I've been in church my whole life, that's me. I'm like, I have nothing. What am I supposed to say? And then I'm singing like, John 3:16, said that God so loved the world, right? And I'm like, it's not helpful in this moment. It's story time. Story time. Tell them about your life before Christ and then what your life has been like with Christ since then. That's your testimony. If you've heard this song, this is my testimony from death to life, this is your testimony. Your testimony is your story. It's a gospel message about someone's life who's been changed forever by the grace of God, by an encounter with Jesus. It's powerful and worth telling. And you might be hesitant to share your testimony because it's not impressive. For me, I thought that my whole life through college. I was like, I have the least impressive testimony. I grew up in a family that had been Christians forever. I was raised in the church since I was a little kid. Super unimpressive testimony. And I looked at my cousin who's a crazy heroin addict and he got saved. And I'm like, he's got a cool one. Your testimony is powerful. If you compare it to others, you might never share it. I found this great quote from this pastor named David Guzik. It's gonna be up on the screen for you. He says, some people refuse to be used by God because they think they aren't ready. We will never be ready on our own standards or merit. The sufficiency is from God, not found in ourselves. Or in other words, some people refuse to be used by God because they think their story isn't ready. Your story is ready, and it's powerful because God has put his stamp of approval on it. He has done the work in your life, and he is doing the work in your life. If you're waiting for this moment, you're like, I can't share my testimony until it's completed. If you wait till then, you will probably be dead. Don't wait till you die. Someone needs to hear your testimony now. I know that I do that with some things. I'm going to tithe when I have enough money. When am I going to have enough money? It's going to keep moving. It's going to keep moving. I'm going to share my testimony when I've come out of this terrible place. Your testimony, even if it's a work in progress, is a testimony of God's faithfulness and goodness through the trial. Even if your testimony is incomplete. it's probably more relatable, honestly, to what everybody else is going through. They're probably going through a trial too if you share your testimony with them. And knowing that God is faithful even through the testimony, not when it's completed. Even through the trial, not when it's completed. But he is faithful when it's completed too. Your story is a gospel message of faithfulness. Because if he could do it for me, if he could do it for you, then he could do it for the person you're talking to as well. Our faith stories introduce people to Jesus. Our testimonies aren't the only faith stories, though, that we have that introduce people to Jesus. I don't know if you grew up in church, but I did. My dad was a pastor, so that's why I'm extra cool. And that was a joke, yeah. Usually you're really not cool, that's a stereotype. And so growing up in church, what made you, even if you didn't grow up in church, what made you fall in love with Jesus in the first place? For me, being a little kid, what made me fall in love with Jesus first were the stories. Growing up in Sunday school, they don't hammer home theology. They're not going through systematic theology. They tell stories. Stories like David and Goliath, Samson, Jonah, the prodigal son, the paralytic who was lowered through the roof, Jesus and the Samaritan woman, Jesus walking on water, Jesus turns water to wine, the crucifixion, the resurrection. And I'm sure just listening to some of these stories, like I could call random people up and they could like tell the gist of the story. Not word for word, but you get the message across. Because we know way more than we think, right? These stories are faith stories. And they're just as powerful as adults as they were when we were kids. And they're our stories. And they reveal Jesus. The description I gave earlier of someone walks up to you and they're like, something's different about you. Or how are you handling this crisis? You look like you're okay. All of us are falling apart. This situation played out for this guy named Richard Wurmbrand. I don't know if you've ever heard of him before. Richard Wurmbrand was in a hopeless situation, surrounded by completely hopeless people. But he had hope and people were noticing and they wanted to know why. So what happened is Richard Wurmbrand he was a Romanian priest in the early 1940s. And the Soviet Union had come into Romania and taken over. And if the Soviet Union had a religion, if you call it that, the national religion was atheism, and they were really intense about enforcing it. And so they had already killed at this point millions of Christians before they entered Romania. And they'd continue to kill more and more Christians. And right when they invaded Romania, they just killed 106,000 of their own priests in their countries. So the Soviet Union comes in and they get together the secret police. Any of you guys could be secret police, all right? You don't know, just your neighbors or your friends. And they got all the pastors together. It's this crazy story. You guys should look it up because it's wild. I can't get into all the details. It'll be here forever, but it's super cool. There are all sorts of books written about it. And it becomes illegal to preach about certain things, to teach about certain things. One of those things is talking about Jesus. And so Richard Wurmbrand goes like James Bond priest style. He's climbing in windows, teaching people about Jesus. He's having secret meetings in the woods talking about Jesus. He has all these secret church meetings to tell people about Jesus. And what happens is the secret police snitches, right? They caught him, turned him in. Richard Wurmbrand gets put in jail. His wife gets put in jail too because the Soviets are crazy. And while he's in jail, he's there with political prisoners, all sorts of the general population of prisoners. And they're just hanging out and he starts to tell them stories from the Bible. And these stories aren't like word for word. He doesn't have it memorized. He's just telling them the gist of the stories from preaching them and reading them so many times. And so he tells them the stories. He's sitting around talking to them. And this is all in the book, Tortured for Christ. You can read this. And he says that he's in the middle of telling the story, like a story one day about like the fishermen or something like that, the disciples. And the guards come in and they yank him out for his daily torture session. And when he gets thrown back in, the prisoners are all talking about what was going on in the Bible story that day. They're like arguing about it, talking about it. And they sit Richard Wurmbrand back down. He's like, ah. And he's so concussed, they had to remind him of what he was doing. From all the torture, he can't remember. And he's like, oh, yeah, yes. They bring him up to speed on the Bible story, and he continues to tell them about what God did, what Jesus did in the Bible. And through these stories, a ton of prisoners were introduced to Jesus and became followers of Jesus. So his mission was really successful in prison. But it wasn't just them. Even the prison guards, the Soviet prison guards that were sent straight from the Soviet Union to be the guards in this Romanian prison, met Jesus as well through interacting with Richard Wurmbrand and hearing the stories from the Bible. Because if God could do it in these biblical stories, then he could do it for me and for you and for those prisoners and for those prison guards. These stories are our stories. These stories are faith stories. And they're just as powerful for adults as they are for kids. Our faith stories introduce people to Jesus. Our faith stories, we share our faith stories also, not just to introduce people to Jesus, but we share our faith stories to encourage one another. Your faith story isn't just your conversion story about what you were like before Christ and what you're like now. Your faith continues. And as your faith continues and the years go on, you get to see how Jesus shows up in your life. How Jesus will provide in the good times, how you feel close to him, and how when even stuff falls apart, you relied on him. Or maybe someone you know relied on him, and how his goodness goes through the trials. So these faith stories keep popping up over and over and over, and we get to see how God will provide and be faithful through the years. And when we share these stories and relive them with our friends or our families, it builds our faith, especially when faith is weak. So this is true for my mom's family. My mom used to tell stories. My mom's family tells these stories about how God has been good and gracious and faithful through the generations of my mom's family. One of the stories that she passed down that we still talk about today is the story about when my grandpa died for the first time. Okay? I know it's silly. And what happened was my grandma and my grandpa had this cool RV. It was a beaver coach. And they would drive all around the 48 states that they could reach on vacation. And they'd get in rallies with a whole bunch of other coaches. They're driving in this like massive convoy. It was super cool. Every once in a while, they'd bring me too. And I felt really cool because you lay down on the couch while you're traveling in a car, no seatbelt, mom doesn't know, eating jelly beans. It was the best. So they're traveling around the country. And when you go on these super, super long drives and you're old, you need to move around, get the blood flowing. How you do that when the weather is all inclement and stuff, right? There is a place, let me tell you, you can go any time of the day, climate controlled, flat floors. It's even open at like 4:30 a.m. when old people wake up, all right? It's the mall. It's dying, but they would go to the mall. So they'd wake up before their journey starts, they'd find a mall. And they'd walk around their mall, get the steps in for the day, exercise a little bit before they're gonna drive like across the country again. It was in one of these days where my grandma and grandpa probably got up way too early, went to the mall, no one's there, and they're just gonna walk around. And my grandma was talking to my grandpa, who was obviously a really attentive listener, because eventually she turned and looked next to her and he was gone. I'm like, how inattentive do you have to be? I'm like, when someone's talking to me, I'm like, yeah, My grandpa must have been giving her nothing, all right? Because she turned around and he's gone. She turns around and he's like a couple hundred feet back, face down. And she's like, oh no. So she goes back to him and by the time that she gets there, it's about to be like, help, right? He's dead. And this guy comes out of nowhere, flips him over and starts giving him CPR and resuscitates him. Story's crazier, okay? This guy is a Marine. He lives a really structured life, very rigid, and he's on vacation with his family. He has written up every single stop he's gonna take because this is when you had to read maps, okay? Maps. You can't just say like search a long route on your phone, right? Hey Siri, bring me to this place. I wouldn't know, I don't have an iPhone, Kevin. But people do that now. There's a map. He had specific stops he was gonna take. And he felt like, he's like, hey, for some reason I feel like we need to stop and get some exercise at a mall, which is a thing, right? So they stop, he gets out, which he never does, And he walks into the mall, and there's a guy who just collapsed in front of him. So he resuscitates him. He's like, this is crazy. I never stop on these random stops. I think I was supposed to stop to bring you back to life. Isn't that crazy? My mom would tell this story when we would have really hard times to show us that God is always going to provide. These are our family faith stories, and you have them too. You have stories of how God has provided for you and your family over and over again, but maybe you've just never thought of it before because we don't write these things down, right? We have an oral history of our families. Maybe it's worth writing these down to remember so you could tell your grandkids about this. Because this is the type of this is how generational faith is developed. We talked about that a while ago. But I knew from this story that God would make a way to provide for me because of this family faith story. These stories have built my faith when my faith is weak. We share our faith stories to encourage one another. God could have chosen any vessel he wanted to spread the gospel message to the world. He could have chosen purely talking donkeys like with Balaam, right? He could have chosen angels, or he could have made something to spread the gospel, but he chose us. He chose people. Every single one of us believers has a gospel message about Jesus that is your faith story. What's your story? Aren't you curious what someone else's story is? I'm curious. I think one day we're gonna get to heaven, we're gonna sit around because we have eternity, and we're just gonna go around hearing people's faith stories, hearing people's testimonies, right? How did God save you? How did God change your life? Because I'm curious. I have a challenge for you tonight. My challenge for you is this service is gonna end, and you're gonna go out into the cafe, and instead of running away or leaving, I want you to go and ask somebody what one of their faith stories is. It is scary, but it's also really interesting. Don't you want to know? Every single person in here has a faith story that is worth sharing, and it's powerful. If you've had an encounter with Jesus, you have a faith story worth sharing, worth being heard. It could change people's lives. Who needs to hear your story? There's got to be someone in here who needs to hear your story. I'm going to read Romans 10 again, but I want you to close your eyes this time because my wife says something about how people are better at listening when you close your eyes. If you really want to take something in, you got to close your eyes. You got to imagine it in your head. Close your eyes. I'm just going to read it one more time. And I want you to take this in because it's worth hearing. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. How then can they call on the one they have not believed in? And how can they believe in the one of whom they have not heard? And how can they hear without someone preaching to them? And how can anyone preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. Sanctuary, this week, I want to challenge you as you go to work or wherever you're going this week to pray for someone to share a faith story with, that you'd have eyes to see them, that they need this faith story. And God will show you somebody, and it's scary, and it's worth doing. It's difficult. But how are they going to believe in whom they have not heard? And this is just my reminder to you. The passage says, how can anyone preach unless they are sent? If you are a believer in Jesus, you are sent. Let me pray for us. Jesus, thank you for just the transformation that you've brought us through. How we're not the same as our old selves. And you've given us the ability to tell the world about it. Tell the world about you and the goodness that you have and the salvation you have, and the full life of freedom that you have for us, not just in this life, but the next. God, you call us to go to all the world. And I pray that this would be heavy on our hearts this week, that we would feel sent because we are sent to tell people about you and your goodness and your mercy and your life. God, I pray that these faith stories would come to our minds throughout the week and invigorate our faith if it is weak. And would you give us the strength and the boldness in those moments where we feel you prompting us to go talk to somebody? God, we need that boldness. May your kingdom come in the lives of the people that came to mind as we were talking about this. And may they see your face, God, this week. And I just bless everybody here with just the hope and spirit of evangelism on their heart for this week. In Jesus' name, amen.